Welcome back. In this video, I'll be going over how the bulk spawner editing utility works. I've shown how to use this in a previous video, so I'm not going to be going over that in this video, but I will be going over how it works. If you want to check out the GitHub repository to read documentation or watch that previous video, they're linked in the description down below. But let's just get into it. The core of this uses the used item on block trigger for advancements that was added in 1.16. When you use a debug stick on a spawner, it will trigger this function here. And this function starts by setting an error code. Basically, I have this feedback function here. This is going to be a non-linear thing. I'm just going to go over things as I find them interesting to talk about. I have the feedback here. I have errors. -1 is a general error. If something just goes wrong somewhere in here, it will give you that general error. There's also other errors. There's something where if you really try hard to miss the spawner, there we go, with the Raycast, which I'll talk about right now. When you use the tool, I run a function to find the spawner. This is just a Raycast that will run this function centered on a spawner once it finds it with a Raycast with a pretty low step resolution, or high step resolution, I guess you can call this. Once it finds a block, we'll get there. There's also this here, this schedule, and then at the end I clear the function as well as revoking this. This is an error prevention, as it says. If the max command chain limit's reached, it could potentially ruin the storage. So I have a backup system in place. Backup. I have create and load. Create just writes the spawners array into a backup storage, as well as writing the current version into storage, and then this just does the same thing in reverse, because if the max command chain limit's reached, it could destroy your spawners array. So this is just there to prevent that. Now let's actually go into the core of this, because all this is just base level stuff. What happens when you use it? When it finds a spawner, it'll run the found spawner function. So we have the use tool /found spawner. I have a flash particle that I left in because I liked how it looked. It's still marked as temp because I can't be bothered. Now, I have right here something that determines what to do based on a condition. So it starts by setting the stick use to 0, and then if it finds a spawner marker entity, which is an area effect cloud, it'll set it to 2. Which, as you can see, is give existing. And then if the player is crouching, which is this predicate here, if I go to BSC predicates, I have has tool and alt. Has tool just checks to see if you debug stick in your main hand or offhand. Alt just checks if you're sneaking. If you're sneaking, it'll change it to 1, which updates existing. That gives the functionality of updating a spawner whenever you crouch. So let's just go in order of these 0, 1, and 2. We have CreateNew. Let me actually go back to functions and use tool. So we have CreateNew. This starts by copying the data from the spawner into storage, and then we remove some extraneous data. The X, Y, and Z, as well as the ID, are unnecessary, and delay could potentially mess up the FindDupe function. So the FindDupe, what folder is that in? Utility. Okay. I also have a utility thing here for giving spawners. This is how the giving. I'm just gonna branch off here. Giving spawners. This is just a bunch of text resolution and a sign. I have a sign really far out, as you can see. This is BSE and hex converted to decimal. This is just a bunch of stuff, and then once I have all of that generated, I also have the spawn potentials lore, which is just a recursive function. if I go to spawner lore, this just runs recursively until you run out of spawn potential stuff. Because I want to be able to display all of the spawn potentials for a spawner. Also, something I have to do is whenever you look at the data of a spawner, all of these values are in shorts instead of in ints. So I have to convert those shorts into ints by just storing the result into a value, and then I just use this same value for all of the things. I also use translate as my text, so I can do %s for insertion. This is just to make this more readable for me and easier to create. You could just do arrays of stuff, but this was just easier for me mentally. And then at the end, after we have all this generated, we then summon an item with a tag, and then write. All of this is being written into a value called item in the main storage that I use. So I then copy that onto the item, then I remove the tag, and then remove that item index in storage. So that's how I create the item, because, you know, I just had to branch off to there. So let's actually talk about how I find dupe values. This has FindDupe and FindDupe loop. So FindDupe starts out by doing some data initialization by writing all of the spawners into an array called checklist, which I remove after I do this, after I run the loop here. I also set the requested ID to -1. This is just so I can add to that. Actually, I don't think I use that anymore. I think that's a redundant command, but whatever. I think it's actually later. I probably won't find it while I'm talking about it here, but whatever. I just start by scrolling this into a check value, and then I copy the current spawner ID into the check value spawner ID, because that's really going to be the only thing that's different. The only thing that's going to be different between two duplicate values, because the spawner ID starts at a default value. So I want to write the current spawner ID into my check value spawner ID, and then I do a duplicate check by storing the result of a data modify, and if it fails, that means the values are the same, but if they are different, it will return a 1. Therefore, I can loop this, and I also loop it if there is both. Basically, I loop this if both there is not a match and there's still stuff in that checklist array. So that's how I find dupes. I know I found a dupe whenever this is 0, meaning that if this exits with a value of 1, then no dupe has been found. So what I do is, if there has been one found, I change this to 3. When this is 3, I can give a different output. And really the only thing that does for this function is not run add current to list. If no duplicate is found, I just add a new entry to the list of spawners. So I have add current to list. This just does 3 things. It adds 1 to the current version, because I do have a version ID for every time I do anything to any spawner that isn't just giving the player a new, that isn't just this action. That doesn't increase the version number. I'll get to what this is for later, the version number specifically. I also store the spawner ID into the current, or I add 1 to the current ID and store that into the spawner ID, and then I append that into the spawners array. And that's how I add a new entry to the list. It's fairly simple to add to. Actually modifying the data is a little bit different, but I'll get to that here in a bit. And then I also summon the area effect cloud right here. This new marker function is just something that executes onto the area effect cloud, which just writes some data onto it, mostly the custom name. Let me get rid of these 2 functions here. Oh, damn it, I just closed my functions utility. Is it find place new or something? What is it CreateNew, and that's in use tool. CreateNew, there it is. I write a name that is the spawner ID, so that generates this text that you see above it. I write that onto the sign, and then I summon an area effect cloud of the tag, and then run this. This is just to reduce error at e calls, because otherwise I'd have to have an at e call for all of this. For every time there's an at s, I would have to have an at e call, and I kind of just don't like to have that. So instead of having 4 at e calls, I have 1 and then 4 at s's, and then I have the give current spawner. So that's how I add a new spawner to the list of spawners. Next we have update, or let's actually do give existing, because this is going to be mildly different, or this is a more simple version of update existing, because this just doesn't write some data. So I have give existing, which first of all grabs the current ID and places that into requested ID, and then I copy that over to edited ID. I could potentially get rid of this if I did an execute store score into this command, but I just don't care enough about command optimization. I also have if the next is scrolling to the requested ID, which only happens if the value isn't 0, because basically what this function does is writes the requested value into the 0 index of the spawners list. It just moves values. Let me actually go to functions utility and scroll to requested ID. This is just a recursive function that removes 1 from requested ID until it hits 0, and once it hits 0, I know, or this moves values into the back array, which I then can return all those values with 1 command afterwards. And I also, this is the value I return it with, and then this clears it. So that allows me to return all of them. What the whole point of this is to write the requested ID into the current object, and then the give spawner function just gives the spawner that's in index 0, and then this also copies the edited, the request, this just does this in reverse, because this function here, requested ID, decrements the requested ID, and I just need to be able to rewrite that for the give spawner, because to request fully, I need to also have the requested ID. It needs to have both the current and requested ID score. So that's how give existing works. To edit existing is just a mild change. So if I go to update existing, this is more or less the same. I have to remove extraneous data, the same that I do for the CreateNew. And then I get the spawner ID, same as I did there, and then I scroll to requested ID, and then I, instead of writing the, if I go to give existing, I write the spawner 0 into current. I do the opposite here. I write current into spawner 0 because I am overwriting that stored value, and then I return it, and then I give spawner. So that's how the whole debug stick functionality works. Whenever you right click, that's everything that can happen. The last few things is the actual slow loop function. There, in the load function here, I do schedule a function called slow loop, and this is something that runs every second. It's a recursive scheduling function. Execute as all area effect clouds every second that have the marker tag. I run this function here, spawners/tick. This resets the age and custom name visible value. If a player is nearby that has the tool on, like they have the debug stick in main hand or offhand, it will set the custom name visible to true. It also has to be a player in creative mode. And then we also have this, which checks if there is not a player within 10 blocks of the spawner marker and the block it is in is not a spawner, it'll kill the marker. This is just so you can like break a spawner and be near it. but also be able to walk away and remove the entity. And this right here is the actual core of how the spawners update. If the version score of the marker is not the current version, it will run the update function. So this function here, update, just grabs the ID of this, then scrolls to the requested ID. It then merges the data of the item or the spawner at the 0 index of the spawner array, because this just scrolls to the requested ID. It'll merge it into the spawner that the marker is in. It will then return it and then update the version. And that's how that works. And then the last thing, which is just a neat little bit of tech for the placing the spawner, how I basically have a parameter. Actually, let me, if I do /data get entity at s selected item, if you look here, I have this function here, function BSE utility /place spawner. This is the same in all of the command blocks. The only difference is this last execution value. Now this doesn't update until after the command that the command block is running is finished running. So I can use it as a parameter. Basically, I set the requested ID score to the last execution value, and then I do the same thing I did to summon the armor stand or the area effect cloud for the CreateNew. This basically just does this right here again, and then set block spawner, and that's how it works. That was probably very rambly and hard to follow, but it went over everything, so hopefully that made some sense. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I will catch y'all next time.